attack is played out, sir. Should we make our way back to the lines? That's one hellish field to make our way over a second time.
Jefferson Davis fled Richmond with $528,000 in gold. By the time they caught him, every penny was gone. The South's war balloons were so bad, Confederate troops shot at their own pilots. One woman kept collecting her father's Civil War pension until she died at 90 in 2020. The Civil War wasn't just brutal, it was bizarre, and some of the weirdest parts have never been properly explained. Let's start with New Orleans. It was the South's biggest city, the main port, and second only to Richmond in importance. But in April 1862, it collapsed almost without a fight. What happened wasn't just a loss. It was a disaster built on arrogance, bad planning, and a complete misunderstanding of how war had changed. Confederate leaders believed the city was safe. They trusted two old forts, Jackson and St. Philip, sitting 70 miles downriver. These brick forts were supposed to stop anything coming up the Mississippi. They didn't. For 7 days, Union forces bombarded them with mortars. But it wasn't the bombardment that ended it. On April 24th, Admiral David Farragut made a bold move. He sent his fleet right past the forts. The guns were still firing, but it didn't matter. The Union ships just pushed through. While this was happening, Confederate command was focused elsewhere. They were obsessed with winning at Shiloh. That's where they sent most of their troops and weapons. Every man and gun they could spare went to Tennessee, not Louisiana. Meanwhile, the Union had a bigger plan. Farragut was coming from the Gulf, and Grant was working his way down from the north. It was a trap, and the South didn't even see it forming. Once the ships got past the forts, everything fell apart fast. Confederate gunners tried to stop them near the city, but they barely lasted. Witnesses said they ran in every direction once the Union returned fire. By April 25th, the city surrendered. The forts held out 4 more days, then gave up 2. The Union lost 229 men. The Confederates lost 782. But the real loss wasn't counted in soldiers. It was economic, and it was brutal. When New Orleans fell, it sent the Southern economy into a tailspin. There was $8 million worth of gold and silver in the banks. Now, out of Confederate hands, people panicked. Prices soared. Inflation hit hard. And worse, global investors panicked too. Confederate bonds, backed by cotton, became worthless almost overnight. Historian Neil Ferguson later said this moment, not Gettysburg, not Antietam, was the real turning point in the war. The South lost its biggest city, its money, and its best chance of getting help from abroad, all in a single week. Then, there was a decision to move the Confederate capital from Montgomery, Alabama, to Richmond, Virginia in May 1861. On the surface, it looked like a patriotic gesture. In reality, it was a gamble that put the entire Confederacy at risk. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, didn't even support the move at first, and for good reason. Richmond sat just 100 miles from Washington, D.C., the heart of the Union. It was vulnerable right from the start. Still, Virginia leaders pushed for it, and by May 20th, 1861, Congress approved the change. Here's the strange part. Virginia hadn't even officially left the Union yet. It voted for secession on April 17th, but the public vote wouldn't happen until May 23rd. And yet, the Confederate government decided on May 8th, 2 weeks before that vote, to relocate to Richmond. It was a move driven by politics and desperation, not strategy. The Confederates wanted to lock down Virginia's loyalty, no matter the cost. But there was another reason behind the shift: industry. Richmond had the Tredegar Iron Works, one of the biggest foundries in America. It was the South's crown jewel. Tredegar made cannon, railroad cars, rails, and iron plates for warships. It also produced bullets, guns, swords, uniform, leather gear, basically everything a wartime army needed. No other southern city could match Richmond's output. From a manufacturing point of view, the move made sense. From a military point of view, it was a nightmare. Richmond quickly became a bullseye for the Union Army. Its location meant it was always in danger. The Union's Peninsula campaign in 1862 pushed troops right to Richmond's outskirts. Battles raged just outside the city. Year after year, Confederate leaders threw men and resources into defending it. And every time they did, they drained strength from other parts of the South. In 1860, Richmond had a population of just under 38,000. It ranked 25th among U.S. cities. But by 1865, it looked like a war zone. The worst day came on April 2nd, 1865, Evacuation Sunday. As Confederate Confederate troops retreated, they were ordered to destroy any supplies the Union might capture. Fires broke out and spread through the city. Whole neighborhoods were abandoned. The next morning, an explosion at the city's powder magazine killed several people and shattered windows across Richmond. The destruction was total. Fires ripped through downtown, leveling everything in their path. Union troops entered a city already in ruins, burned not by enemies, but by its own defenders. After 4 years of brutal war, Richmond didn't fall in battle. It collapsed under the weight of its own poor planning. The decision to defend Richmond at all costs didn't just cost the Confederacy a city, it helped cost them the war. What was meant to be a show of strength became a symbol of failure. They placed their capital within striking distance of their enemy. They built their war plan around one city, and in the end, they lost everything trying to protect it. They say the Civil War ended in 1865, but for one woman, the war kept paying every single month until the year 2020. That woman was Irene Triplett. When Irene died at age 90 in a North Carolina nursing home, she closed a chapter that had been open for 155 years. She was the last person in the United States still receiving a pension from the Civil War. That's not a typo. A war that ended in the 19th century was still costing the government money in the 21st. It sounds impossible until you look at the math. Irene was born in 1930, 65 years after the Civil War ended. Her father, Moses "Mose" Triplett, was 83 years old when she was born. He had married his second wife, Elida Hall, in 1924. She was just 27. That's a 56-year age gap. But during the Great Depression, it wasn't all that strange. Older men, especially war veterans with steady pensions, often found young wives who could care for them. But Mose Triplett wasn't just any old soldier. His war record was something else. He started fighting for the Confederacy at just 16 years old, joining the 53rd North Carolina Infantry in 1862. But the very next year, something dramatic happened. Mose deserted. Not just before any battle. He left just 1 week before his unit. The 26th North Carolina Infantry was nearly wiped out at Gettysburg. 92% of them were killed or wounded. Mose missed death by a few days. He had fallen ill, but many believe he also realized he was fighting for the wrong side. After deserting, he switched. He joined the Union Army. That single decision would change his family's fate forever. In 1885, 20 years after the war ended, Mose applied for a Union Army pension, and he got it, even though he had once fought for the Confederacy. The U.S. government, eager to heal old wounds, was willing to forgive and pay. That check kept coming for decades. And because Irene had mental disabilities, she qualified to keep receiving it as a helpless adult child of a veteran. She never stopped getting it, not once. For decades, Irene received $73.13 every month. That figure goes all the way back to at least 1958. It never increased, but it meant the world to her. She and her mother, who also suffered from mental illness, spent much of their lives in poorhouses and care facilities. That small pension helped keep them afloat. From the end of the war in 1865 to Irene's death in 2020, the U.S. government never missed a payment. 155 straight years. That's likely the longest-running benefit program in American history. Over her lifetime, Irene received around $52,853 in Civil War pension money. Add in what her father and possibly others in the family received, and the total payout to the Triplett family exceeded $136,000. And that's without adjusting for inflation. It's easy to forget how long the shadow of war can last. For Irene, the Civil War wasn't ancient history. It was a monthly check, a lifeline, a strange legacy from a father born in the 1840s, who fought on both sides and whose decision to switch sides may have saved his life and hers. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a politician. But in her quiet way, Irene Triplett was the final footnote of a war that shaped a nation and never really ended. Missouri's role in the Civil War took a strange and desperate turn when its Confederate government fled the state entirely. It started in 1861. The governor at the time, Claiborne Fox Jackson, refused to swear loyalty to the United States. Union forces responded quickly. They moved in and took control of Jefferson City, forcing Jackson to run for his life. But But Jackson didn't give up. He tried to keep Missouri tied to the Confederacy, even while on the run. He built a government on the move. It drifted from place to place, like a boat with no anchor. First, they ended up in Arkansas, but things didn't get any better. In 1862, Jackson died of cancer, and Thomas C. Reynolds became the new leader. That didn't stop the chaos. Union troops captured more ground, including Little Rock, so Reynolds had to escape again. In late 1863, Reynolds made a bold and strange choice. He moved Missouri's Confederate government to Marshall, Texas, more than 400 miles away from Missouri. It made no sense geographically, but politically, it was the last place left. Marshall had become an important Confederate supply base. It also had factories making gunpowder and had hosted high-level meetings with Southern and Native American leaders. It even earned the nickname City of Seven Flags, Missouri's flag being one of them. Reynolds set up his new capital inside a normal Victorian home on East Crockett Street. The government offices were placed at 402 South Boulevard Street. It was a strange image, Missouri's government operating from a quiet Texas neighborhood. It was like pretending a city still existed after it had been wiped off the map. The truth was, Reynolds had no power. Missouri was fully under Union control. The so-called Confederate government had no authority and no land. They couldn't pass laws or command troops. They were basically writing letters and holding on to symbols of power that meant nothing. Yet the Confederacy still tried to support this ghost government. Near the end of the war, they shipped $9 million in treasury notes and another $3 million in postage stamps to Marshall. It was as if they thought Marshall could become the South's last stronghold, but it was too late. The numbers tell the real story. Missouri sent around 110,000 soldiers to fight for the Union. Only about 40,000 joined the Confederate side. So the government in Marshall was claiming to represent a state that had largely turned against them. It got even more absurd when Marshall became the headquarters for the Trans-Mississippi Postal Department. Missouri's mail was being handled in Texas by officials who had never controlled a single post office in Missouri. This strange story finally ended in 1865 when the Confederacy collapsed. But Missouri's wandering government left behind a surreal legacy. It was one of the most bizarre attempts at political theater in American history. A government without a country, a flag without a people, all to keep up the illusion that Missouri was still part of a Confederate dream that had long since died. They say history is written by the victors, but every now and then, a bizarre footnote sneaks past the red ink. In the middle of America's bloodiest conflict, a tiny German duchy no one remembers today made one of the strangest diplomatic decisions in the entire Civil War. On July 30th, 1861, just a few months after the South fired on Fort Sumter, the Confederate government quietly approved a diplomatic request from a man named Charles Erhardt. He was acting on behalf of the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a miniature German state most famous for being the birthplace of Prince Albert. Yes, Queen Victoria's husband. What did this recognition mean? Technically, it made Saxe-Coburg-Gotha one of the only European governments to formally acknowledge the Confederate States of America. Now, that might sound like a big deal, but it wasn't. Not really. This wasn't France or Britain stepping in. Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was tiny. It didn't even have its own foreign policy. It had to rely on bigger German states to speak for it in international matters. Its only real clout came from royal marriages. But the Confederacy was desperate. Recognition, any recognition, was gold to them. And in 1861, they were still dreaming big. They believed Europe needed their cotton so badly, nations would line up to support them. By that point, the South was supplying 77% of Britain's cotton, 90% of France's, and a staggering 92% of Russia's. Cotton wasn't just a crop, it was a weapon. That's why Senator James Hammond had famously declared, "Cotton is king." So this little stamp of approval from a small German duchy looked like a crack in the door, but it turned out to be a mirage. Saxe-Coburg-Gotha's recognition was mostly the personal move of one man, Erhardt. He saw a business opportunity. The Union's naval blockade was crushing the South's ability to export. In 1860, the South shipped out 3.8 million bales of cotton. By 1862, that number had dropped to almost zero. Erhardt likely thought he could carve out a corner of this disruption and make money off it, but his duchy didn't back him in any meaningful way. The larger European picture tells us why this was so strange. Britain and and France, the real powers the South wanted, stayed out. They had their reasons. British manufacturers in Manchester and Liverpool screamed for Southern cotton. So did the French. Merchants even begged Napoleon III to recognize the Confederacy, but Europe had bigger worries. Britain didn't want to provoke the Union and risk its colonies in Canada, and countries like France and Austria feared what would happen if America split in two. A strong, united U.S. was a useful counterweight to British global power. Still, this wasn't the Confederacy's most curious international drama. That title belongs to a man named Judah Philip Benjamin. His escape from the wreckage of the Confederacy is the stuff of spy novels. Benjamin was Jefferson Davis's right-hand man, Secretary of State, a key architect of the Confederacy. And when it all fell apart in 1865, he didn't get caught. He disappeared. On April 2, 1865, as Richmond burned, Benjamin boarded the last train out. He had already burned sensitive files, including everything related to Confederate espionage. He knew the game was over. Davis still believed they could rally and keep fighting. Benjamin didn't. By May 3rd, he broke off from Davis's entourage and went on the run. What happened next is almost unbelievable. He used disguises so clever they sound made up. He pretended to be a mute French farmer, traveling in a broken-down carriage while hiding gold. Then, on a ship captained by a Confederate sympathizer, he posed as a Jewish cook, complete with apron and a face smeared with soot. A Union soldier reportedly said it was the first time he'd seen a Jew doing hard labor, and Benjamin didn't take the easy way out. He avoided Mexico, avoided Cuba. Instead, he vanished into the swamps of Florida. A secret network of Confederate supporters helped him hide, people like John T. Leslie, James McKay, and C.J. Munnerlyn. They sheltered him in plantations, barns, and even the Gamble Mansion in Ellington. The trip nearly killed him. One ship exploded en route to Nassau. Another caught fire after leaving St. Thomas, but he kept moving. Eventually, he reached Britain, and that's when he did something even more mysterious. He erased himself. No memoirs, no letters, no speeches. He destroyed almost every personal document he ever wrote. Historians today have just 6 pages of his writing. When a biographer tried to tell his story in 1884, Benjamin refused. "I would much prefer," he said, "that no life, not even a magazine article, should ever be written about me." Why? What was he hiding? Was he protecting people? Secrets? Or just tired of the war's ghost? We may never know. But what we do know is this. While other Confederate leaders were captured, killed, or humiliated, Judah Benjamin walked away. He started a new life as a respected British lawyer, built a second career from nothing, and died wealthy and successful. They say gold never disappears, but in 1865, it did. Millions of dollars vanished into thin air. The story of the lost Confederate gold isn't just about missing money. It's about betrayal, desperation, lies, and a war crumbling faster than its leaders could run. It all began when Richmond, the heart of the Confederacy, was about to fall. On April 3, 1865, Jefferson Davis and his closest officials abandoned the capital. With them, they carried what was left of the Confederate treasury, about $528,000 in gold and silver bullion. That's over $10 million in today's money. Among it was Mexican silver coinage, the last solid money the Confederacy had. But as they fled south, things quickly unraveled. Davis needed to keep his troops loyal and moving, so he started handing out the treasure. Some went to General Joseph E. Johnston in Greensboro, North Carolina, to cover payroll. Other parts were deposited into Southern banks for safekeeping. But everyone knew the Confederacy was finished. That money wouldn't stay safe for long. By the time Davis reached Washington, Georgia, there was barely anything left, only $43,000 in cash. What happened in between was chaos. In Wilkes County, Georgia, a wagon train full of gold from Richmond's banks was ambushed. But it wasn't just Union troops. It was a wild mix of deserters, looters, and anyone who'd caught wind of the treasure. Eyewitnesses described it like something out of a fever dream. Thieves waded knee-deep in gold and silver coins. They filled their boots, coats, and saddlebags. Some grabbed so much they couldn't carry it all and started hiding it in the woods. One man said the coins were spilling ankle-deep onto the ground. That robbery turned the South into one giant treasure map, and the legend was just beginning. Then came the lies. On April 26, 1865, Union General Henry Halleck claimed that Davis was fleeing with $6 to $13 million. That wasn't true. The U.S. Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, had made it up. Why? To spread spread panic, to make Confederate soldiers hunt down Davis in hopes of getting rich. It worked. Davis became a moving target, and the myth of the missing gold exploded across the country. The collapse didn't stop with the robbery. Confederate Secretary of Treasury George Trenholm was arrested after the war. Some believed he stole millions, but he had fallen sick and left Davis's group before the worst of the chaos. Brigadier General Edward Porter Alexander did manage to recover about $110,000 from the Wilkes County thieves, but most of the gold was never seen again. This wasn't just a financial disaster. It crippled the Confederate war effort. In New Orleans, the massive warship CSS Louisiana sat unfinished. Contractors refused to keep working. They hadn't been paid. Confederate rules said money had to be sent to Richmond first before payments could be made. But Richmond was burning, so the ship stayed in dry dock, useless. And during the Vicksburg campaign, General Kirby Smith couldn't even rally his full force. He had 80,000 men on paper, but only 20,000 showed up. The rest deserted. Their families were starving, and they hadn't been paid in months. Still, the mystery of the gold never died. In the 1930s, teenagers in Baltimore stumbled upon thousands of gold coins buried under a house, worth over $260,000 today. And in the 2020s, the Great Kentucky Hoard was found. More than 700 Civil War-era coins, likely buried before Morgan's raid in 1863. The last coin in that stash was also from 1863. People still believe Confederate treasure is out there, buried under fields and floorboards, waiting to be found. When Jefferson Davis was captured on May 10, 1865, near Irwinville, Georgia, he didn't have a single gold coin left. Everything was gone. The treasure he carried, the money meant to prop up a dying government, had been scattered, stolen, or buried. No one has ever fully recovered it. They say the American Civil War was fought with muskets and bayonets, but there was something floating above the battlefield that no one expected. Balloons, not children's toys, but giant gas-filled machines that rewrote the rules of war. They weren't just for show. These balloons could spy from 1,000 feet in the air, guide artillery from miles away, and trigger chaos in enemy camps, all in the 1860s. It started in 1861 when a scientist named Thaddeus Lowe joined the Union Army. He wasn't a soldier, he was a balloonist, but he didn't come with just one balloon, he came with a whole system. 7 military balloons, portable hydrogen generators, buckboard wagons that could carry the gear to any battlefield. These weren't just experimental toys, they were flying eyes, and they worked. Each balloon took up to 30 men to manage. They flew 500 to 1,000 feet above ground. From that height, they could see nearly 15 miles across. If there was a hill or a ridge in the way, the balloon didn't care. It could see over everything. In a time when generals relied on horseback messengers and guesswork, this was like having a satellite. The real shock came on September 24, 1861. That day, Lowe directed Union artillery at Confederate forces 3 miles away in Falls Church, Virginia. The gunners couldn't even see the enemy, but Lowe could, and he guided them using flags and telegraphs. That moment was the birth of modern artillery spotting, what today's armies call forward observers. It was a game changer. The Confederate troops didn't take this lightly. During the Peninsula Campaign, they started covering their camps at night, using blackout techniques and building fake cannons, wooden logs painted black, called Quaker guns. This wasn't just panic, it was tactical deception, and it worked so well, these tricks would be copied again in World War II, including before D-Day. But the balloons were also magnets for gunfire. Every time one went up, Confederate cannons opened fire. The problem? The cannons couldn't reach them. At 1,000 feet, Civil War artillery simply didn't have the range or accuracy. Ironically, this constant firing gave away Confederate positions, making the balloons even more effective. Still, danger was everywhere, even from the Union's own side. Union troops sometimes shot at their own balloons by mistake. They looked strange and unfamiliar. One of Lowe's designs was bright orange, covered in stars, something no soldier had ever seen. Lowe thought the bold colors would scare scare the Confederates. They did, but it also made the balloons huge targets. Despite all this, no Union balloon was ever shot down during the war. Not one. They were just too high, too far back, and too unpredictable. But that didn't mean things always went smoothly. On April 11, 1862, Union General John Porter took a ride in one of Lowe's balloons. Lowe told him to use at least 3 ropes for safety. Porter used just one. He wanted to get higher, faster. Big mistake. The rope snapped, loud as a gunshot. Suddenly, Porter was drifting over Confederate territory, alone. From above, enemy marksmen tried to shoot him down. He ignored the bullets. Instead, he pulled out a pencil and started sketching everything he saw: troop positions, trenches, artillery. When the wind finally pushed him back to safety, he came down calmly, handed over his drawings, and walked away like nothing had happened. But General McClellan wasn't so calm. He called it a terrible scare in a letter to his wife. Not every story ended that cleanly. The Confederacy, too, wanted balloons, but they had no access to hydrogen or the right equipment, so they improvised. Captain John Randolph Bryan was chosen to lead the program. He admitted he had never even seen a balloon before. Still, he built one from cotton, coated it in varnish, and filled it with hot air instead of hydrogen. Surprisingly, it worked at first. On April 13, 1862, Bryan flew over Yorktown and spied on Union forces. The flight was crude but useful. But then came the disaster. During a night mission, a soldier accidentally got tangled in the balloon's tether and cut the line. Bryan floated away, over enemy lines, in the dark, with no control. Confederate troops saw the shape in the sky and assumed it was a Union spy. They opened fire on their own balloon. Bryan survived, but the balloon didn't. It crashed and was destroyed. The Confederate balloon program ended right there. Even with limited technology, the South had tried to fight back. Edward Porter Alexander, one of their officers, even mounted cannons on steep angles, turning them into makeshift anti-aircraft guns. It was the first recorded use of anti-aircraft artillery, but it came decades before the concept would become standard in World War I. In the end, the Union balloons flew for years. The Confederates' effort lasted only months. It wasn't just about floating above the battlefield. It was about who had the science, the resources, and the vision to see beyond the horizon.